familiarity is a very, very major component of good UX. You kind of find yourself as a UX architect or a person who creates experiences being very aware of what's on that inner circle of familiar. And so someone has to represent that end user at that table with a vision and kind of push that development team to go beyond what they think is possible, to try to challenge them to creating experiences that are hard. Beg for that project. Let me just build a bot for my team. Let me just build a bot for our internal team. Even if it's outside of, like, hey, let's just find out if our team has a group of designers, architects, user research folks that are interested in the area, informally kind of gather and say, hey, let's just as a team build something together.
Welcome back to Invisible Machines. I've been describing this podcast as existing at the intersection of UX and AI. As I collaborated with Rob Wilson on our book, Age of Invisible Machines, he and I spent a lot of time talking about the ways that conversational AI represents the next phase of experience design. One of the main goals of UX has always been reducing the amount of friction users encounter when working with technology. A conversational interface reduces that friction to almost nothing. When users can just ask a machine for help, whether by speaking out loud or typing a message, the relationship between people and technology fundamentally shifts. But just because these experiences aren't primarily visual in nature doesn't mean they don't need to be designed. We need designers challenging technologists with a vision for end user experience. Rob's been working with conversational AI for 20 years, but before that, he founded one of the world's first experience design agencies. He's a real UX pioneer, and I was eager to pick his brain a bit about the changing role of the experience designer in this new AI-enabled world. So let's get to that conversation right now.
All right, Rob. So I've been describing this podcast in the intro frequently as existing kind of at the intersection of UX and AI. So what I was hoping to talk a little bit about today is what sits at that intersection and what designers need to be thinking about as they kind of prepare to bring more AI into their work. So let's go from there.
Yeah, it's funny. I somehow kind of think of this more of like, what is at the intersection of AI and UX, especially conversational AI? I almost would say they're parallel streets. They don't intersect right now. I mean, that's my experience with most UXers out there is they're not intersecting. And we're trying to, I think that's just a big part of what we're trying to do here is
create that intersection.
Yeah. It's like, come on, guys, these streets should intersect. We need these people badly, horribly. So why are they not intersecting is probably the bigger question, not what's at the intersection. That's more of like, well, we'll be at the intersection when they finally intersect.
Yeah.
And I think both are fascinating questions to explore, but the first is why aren't they intersecting? And I've given a lot of thought to this. I've been puzzling this for a while because, in order to try to create that intersection, you have to understand, what is it that's preventing them, this huge community of UX folks and designers from engaging in conversational AI in the way that I think the world needs them to. And I would say that the latest, theory at this moment, from being in UX for so long, is that familiarity is a very, very major component of good UX. You kind of find yourself as a UX architect or a person who creates experiences being very aware of what's on that inner circle of familiar. We've got this sort of donut, right? And in the center of the donut, the hole, we've got this, we've seen it all before. Things that are very familiar to us, drop-down menus, checkboxes, these are like very familiar. A lot of that is dictated by the operating systems, that we're all used to. They tend to lead the charge on creating the inner circle of familiarity. And so, a lot of design happens in that inner circle of nobody's invented anything new. Nobody's created anything unique. They're just copying other things that are familiar to people, and that drops cognitive load, right? So all of this is on a continuum of how much cognitive load do we want to provide, or do we want to, infect on people when we design something. The lower the cognitive load, the less friction, the more likely they are to complete a task. And so when it comes to all this productivity, cognitive load is a high consideration for designers. So familiarity then weaves and connects super closely with, the cognitive load. And then you got like the better designers, I would say, the sort of level 2 designers, which sit in the donut part, right? Which is they create and design experiences that are familiar enough, but not exact copies. And they sit in that area of novel and fresh, but not outside of the donut, which is unfamiliar and high cognitive load. So without a lot of examples of good experiences, you could sort of look at the donut hole for conversational AI and say it's barely a hole. It's like a pinhole. There's just not a lot of great experiences out there that people have on a regular basis to inspire this group. So therefore, most anything they design is going to be quite unfamiliar to them, unfamiliar to the end user, and in essence, sit outside of the donut altogether. And so it's just the chicken or the egg, until we have more examples of great experiences utilizing both extralingual and lingual components like, imagery and interactions and micro UIs within conversation. Until we have more examples of that, then we're going to see that designers live inside the familiar zone. And so they're sort of waiting for the market to catch up to them to care about it. And so it is a chicken and the egg, because we don't have great experiences because they're not engaged. So we need some of these designers to take these risks, particularly the good ones, right? That can set the bar to create what's familiar. I think that's coming really soon. Microsoft is talking about now basically having a chat GPT in all of their products, just across the board. So what we see is the OS providers, again, potentially leading the charge here and saying, well, once they carve a path to good experiences for the rest of us to follow, then they'll create that familiar zone, and then we'll engage the community more broadly. But in the meantime, we'll just keep trying to inspire designers to think beyond just language, to think of conversational AI as multimodal, to have both visual and linguistic components within them, and to reinvent how they think about it, and set the bar for the rest of the design community. I don't know what
Well,
you're.
you've said a few times that that we really need designers
Yeah.
to step up and do this work. And then you talk about how these big OSs are kind of leading the charge, but is that not really ideal? Would it be better to have, do you think, more designers kind of out there on the fringes trying to explore that way, especially given how quickly things change with this technology and how accelerated everything is around it?
Yeah, there's no question. I mean, it's sort of like the original web pages being designed by developers, they just look terrible. Um, uh, we need all of the ingredients and the mechanics of, what good design is, like empathy, user research, creative thought, problem solving, people who lack the constraint of the technology, don't limit themselves to what the technology can do, but imagine outside of the technology what the ideal experience is, and challenge the technologists to come up with solutions to build those, right? It's the way you think of designers setting the bar for technologists. They set the bar for, and they challenge them, right? And without them at the table, then the technologists, aren't challenged enough. They're challenged by how fast they can make something, how easy they can make it for the developer to create, but now how easy they can make it for the end user to operate. And so someone has to represent that end user at that table with a vision and kind of push that development team to go beyond what they think is possible, to try to challenge them to creating experiences that are hard to pull off. I was thinking about this the other day, where I was, one of the ways to make ChatGPT work is context. Like, context is everything. You want it to work well, provided the context. And I came up with a simple example, which is just trying to get ChatGPT to greet you based on the time of day, right? Good morning, good afternoon, good evening.
Yeah.
It doesn't know the time of day. Like, that's not how it works. It predicts the next word, but it has no sense of what time of day it is for wherever that model's running, whatever server that model's running on. And it has no sense of what time of day, even more importantly, to the end user that's interacting with it. It's just predicting next word, right?
Yeah.
But if you tell it the time of day, right, it makes that next word prediction account for it. And it is more likely to include it. So getting it to say good morning requires you to tell it it's morning. So I thought about, from a developer standpoint, for anybody listening to that, it's like, well, that seems like it should be able to do that pretty easy, right? Like, God, it can write an essay. How could it not know if it's morning or night or afternoon? Like, come on, this has got to be easy, right? And so I went through the steps. Like, first step is, no, you got to tell it it's morning. Second step is, before you can tell it it's morning, you got to know who's talking to it and where they're talking to it from and what time zone they're in, and then what time it is. And then if that's morning, all of that, let's call it code, all that logic happens and needs to happen outside of ChatGPT. And then you can say, hey, greet this person based on the fact that it's morning. And then ChatGPT will do that, right? And the more context you provide, the better that experience is going to be for the end user. That little delightful moment where it knows it's morning or afternoon or evening is particularly handy when it's relevant, right? Like, hey, you're calling me in the morning. Does that mean appointments? Like, is this a good time for you to call back? Like, is this a good time? Well, I have to know what this time is, right? And so you go through all of that and you go, well, that's a lot of code to figure out and just to tell ChatGPT that it's morning, a developer is probably just going to say, it's a lot of work. I'm not going to greet them based on morning or afternoon. I'm just going to say, hi, how are you? Just skip it, right?
Yeah.
But that just might be the thing that makes the difference between delighting that end user and making them feel like you understand them and you know them, and then feeling very generic, even if it's subtle. So these subtle things, they add up to an overall great experience, right? They add up to a halo effect that you get enough of these in the conversation, and the end user, they may not particularly point out all of the things you did, but just at the end, they're going to have this feeling and sense that that experience was elevated, that it was special, and that it was special as in geared and hyper-personalized towards them. So who's going to come in and say, we're going to greet them based on time and day, and challenge the development team to figure out how they're going to find out what time of day it is to that end person? We have this information. If they're on a browser, we can know this, and as a technologist, this is something you can figure out. But it takes someone pushing you to do it. You're not going to come up with that on your own, because on a practical nature, you may say, it's
too much work.
It's too much work. I don't want to do that. I'll just say, hi, how are you?
Well, and all of that kind of points to an idea that we've talked about a lot, that, ChatGPT is really kind of a front end,
right,
looking for a back end. And, and like thinking in terms of context is something that designers are certainly comfortable with. But I wonder too if,
they're very comfortable with it. Yeah.
Yeah. But a lot of the current design that's out in the world in terms of that's attached to technology, I guess, has a heavy visual component, or maybe the visual aspect is kind of the first tangible element of it in a way. So I wonder if there's a bit of a disconnect there as well, where, now you're designing things that you're not necessarily thinking about how they'll be seen, but how they'll be felt almost, or interpreted by someone who's interpreting it as natural language and not as, a visual design or something like that.
It kind of gets into this other area of brain activity, which is the geospatial side of it versus the linguistics. Our linguistic capabilities in our brain tend to be much more powerful than our geospatial capabilities, and of course it depends on the person, but it's pretty well accepted, generally accepted truth, right?
Right.
And I'm more likely to be able to navigate through words than remembering, how I got to, point B. So if I find myself in a place where, I'd been to the post office in some city once 10 years ago, my ability to re-navigate back to that city, knowing that many things have changed and my memory's faded, versus my ability to just use language to ask people for directions, right? It's very clear that one's much easier. I'm not going to forget how to ask for directions to the post office, but I am likely to forget how to get to the post office. I'm more likely, right? So once we realize that most of these dashboards we create, most of these designs, even the language, right? The navigation bar, the menu that allows you to deep link, all of these words, they signal navigation, they signal geospatial, right? How do I get to the place where I can check sales for the month? How do I find, these signal these are geospatial tools that we're using to find our way around and navigate a UI. Navigate, right? we don't use these terms when it comes to language. How do I ask where the post office is? So we're using different areas of our brain with language. And yeah, I guess a lot of our designers out there are designed to create geospatial maps that allow people to discover things, where they've never been there before, and use sort of that tool set to allow people to get what they want, it's an experience, a geospatial experience versus a linguistic experience, which is trying to understand someone's intent, how to solve their problem and anticipate what they're going to want. But where those things are different, where I feel like they overlap in the most important way, is that no matter what you're designing, if it's geospatial or not, you really have to get into the mind of the person and understand who they are and where they're coming from, so that whatever interface you put in front of them is in context. And if you don't think about their context, if you don't empathize with where they are, what triggered them to get there, what they're looking for, it's going to be much more difficult to design an intuitive experience either way. And so those tools that designers have of, really understanding the end user and empathizing and thinking about the context of where they are, those are the tools that are so critical to conversational AI. Even prompt engineering on GPT, the more context you give it, the better it performs. So just like a graphical UI, the more context the designer has, the better the experience, the more obvious it is to the end user, the more useful it is. The same goes for GPT. The more context you provide it in the prompt before it communicates, the better the experience is going to be. So it's all the same tools: the user testing, the user research, the understanding the user and their motivations, what triggered them to come there. All of this stuff is, almost identical, and it just manifests in a conversationally contextualized experience instead of a dashboard. And it still has graphical elements. You should use graphical elements. The whole picture's worth 1,000 words. Graphical communication, the extralingual stuff, has just as much a place in conversation as it has in graphical dashboard UIs as we know them. So, but again, I think most designers feel like they're left out, like literally left out of the conversation, right? Because they think it's all lingual. And because that's most of our examples, they're voice-based interfaces that don't have a lot of visual components that partner up with them. So again, the more we see these examples, the more it's going to trigger that community to get involved. So it's like seeding the world with some great demos and examples of this working in a way that is clearly superior to, dashboard UIs. This is going to go on, I think. I hope. I mean, we need them. We need them. If I've talked,
sounds like
we need you.
It sounds like there's a chance here for an even better alliance too between designers and developers, right? If like designers are going to be demanding this extra context, they'll have to turn to developers on the back end to try and figure out how to orchestrate the technology and find it. Because I mean, in a lot of ways, this really lets experienced designers kind of ply their trade without as many constraints, right? They can meet users exactly where they are. I mean, they can really create fine-tuned user experiences, personalized experiences in a way that they've never been able to before.
Yeah. What's unusual about this moment, I think, in the UX community and the UX world, is that this is a moment where the technology is ahead of the design. It's in the sort of internet world. the designers have, been designing stuff that developers can't build. That's been the big complaint, right? It's designers have been ahead, just always creating stuff that the developers are scratching their head going, oh my God, this is going to take forever, right? Always pushing the envelope. And the technology trying to catch up to the types of things that designers and ideas that designers have and create. So there's just all this compromise going on. I see the opposite in conversational AI. I see designers not even coming close to pushing the limits of the technology, kind of being very basic in terms of how they think about it. And again, I do expect that to shift, but the technology now is ahead of most of the experiences that we have out there. Most of the experiences don't reflect the capability of the tech we have. And I think it's just because this tech is coming out at such a rapid speed. It's, it's disrupting, disruptive technologies. So, yeah.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about business leaders needing to push themselves outside of their comfort zones and kind of be willing to fall on their faces a bit. It sounds like designers need to also kind of be pushing their limits and making themselves uncomfortable and working in these gray areas a little.
Yeah, I think if you look at a designer, you're going to see that the designer tends to live pretty close to the business, right? I mean, it's business goals, business objectives, these sort of things. There's a lot of alignment there, and therefore, the business wants to stay pretty familiar. They're not big risk takers when it comes to design. They want it to look good, but they don't want to push the envelope. So the same thing for them. They're trying to mitigate risk. The bigger the company, the more they're in that mode I think it's just like any wealth management scenario. You have companies that are big enough and worth enough that they go into a wealth conservation mode. It's risk mitigation, it's diversification, it's we have something worth a lot of money. Our shareholders want us to, not take big risks and to try to diversify and manage this asset in such a way that we preserve wealth, and the same principles around wealth preservation. So don't take big risks. This is sort of the nature of having something versus having nothing to lose, right? So small companies have nothing to lose. That's why they take risks. Big companies have a lot to lose. That's why they don't take big risks. Now we're entering the age of not taking big risks as big companies is risky. It's a new idea, dangerous. Right? It's completely the opposite. We look at Google and what just happened, right? Not running fast enough on Lambda has given Microsoft new life in the search world, right? It's brought in a competitor that out of nowhere, really.
People
if
are
you
talking
think
about Bing again.
So, yeah, it's happening.
Who'd have thought? Is the Zune coming back?
Yeah. And how fast did that happen? Yeah, Alta Vista.
Yeah.
What's going to Ask Jeeves.
Oh, yeah, this is perfect timing for Jeeves. He was looking to be asked this whole time, just asking.
Yeah, we were ahead of our time. And it's no joke. Like, this could really happen, right? So yeah, it's designers, though, they speak the language of business, honestly. Mm-hmm. I think business trusts the UX community. The UX community knows how to talk to business.
Yeah.
They know how to talk to the business side. They are that translator or that intermediary between people and technology, and therefore, since managers and executives are people, and they tend to interact with technology through the eyes of their customer more than the eyes of their developers, the design community is the bridge. And so what we're looking at is, for right or for wrong, I think for right, but we're looking at upper management saying, I don't trust the design acumen of our IT folks. I trust that they understand technology, but I don't trust them to create an experience that our customers are going to appreciate, and therefore it's risky. And so on one hand, they're saying we got to adopt AI. On the other hand, they're saying, but I don't trust my team to implement in such a way that they'll create safe and familiar and great experiences for customers. So in a way, they're stuck, right? And so one obvious answer to me is like, engage the design community. Like, they're just not at the table. They're simply not there. I had a speaking engagement at Frog recently, Frog Design. I was, they're innovators in graphic design and in interface design. Like they go in and they lead. And I found it very fascinating to see, that from what I could tell and the folks that I were talking to, they're not, they may be ahead in the design community on this thinking, but they're far from ahead on conversational AI thinking, just ahead of, others in the design world, but certainly not caught up to where we are. So my goal there is to engage them, right? And I can see in the folks I was talking to, I can see them looking for an opening, trying to find a place for themselves. I could see them looking for where to enter the conversation and where they can provide value. And I could also see the struggle at that not being obvious. And so my personal opinion on that is, start before the design phase, start before you actually wireframe, go back to user research and journey mapping and, all of the things that we have all been fighting so hard to make a part of the design process for our customers. And don't worry about the manifestation of the experience until you've done that research, because it sort of emerges right from that. Once you know the customer, once you know what they want, you then have a basis for thinking about what that conversational experience needs to be. So kind of going to the front of the design stack, and doing all the things that are familiar. And then when it comes to manifesting them, it's just, that's where the taking some risks come in.
I'm getting this romantic vision right now of a business leader and a designer kind of holding hands and just taking that leap together. I wonder if there might be something in that, because you were talking about how uniquely suited experienced designers are to really communicate with business leaders. And I think part of that might be because it took so many years. It took like a decade at least for UX practitioners to really kind of get that seat at the table.
Yeah, and I think it's the same thing that I keep seeing is, the justification for budget comes from cost cutting instead of, optimizing productivity and top line. It's always like, how do I save on labor? And then they immediately go to customer service implementations because it's the most obvious, way to save on labor in their minds. Like, oh, I can, get rid of human agents. And what they don't realize they're saying is, hey, let's experiment on our customers as we're trying to learn this thing, right?
Yeah.
It would be much easier if business and design decided to take a leap together on internal employee experiences, because, those employees are going to be in it with them, in it to learn, in it to give them feedback. They're a much better audience to practice on. And then once you feel like you've nailed that, then go to customers. And so there's an investment that says, hey, let's invest in employee first experiences. And the business case that will inevitably pay for it will be the customer experience. And so just thinking bigger and saying, the investment is ultimately, the return on that is going to come from the customer saving side and the customer experience side. And in the meantime, the employee productivity, is a huge plus. On top of it, it's kind of the cherry on top, instead of trying to justify the employee experience creation of conversational AI through some cost-cutting measure. Saying, do we have a IT call help desk that we can fire people on? It's not gonna, typically for most companies, it's not gonna fund a useful conversational AI practice.
Yeah. Well, and if you start working internally with conversational AI, you mentioned seeing the looks on these designers' faces, wondering like, where is my future with this technology coming in? If you're working on it in-house, people are getting to see like, oh, it's the future of this technology is it's making my job suck less. Like,
yeah,
I actually enjoy what I'm doing and I'm a little more inspired. And
yep.
That's the hope anyway.
In the end, the summary, I think, is that designers need they need something to practice on. They need someone to practice on.
Yeah.
That's really what it comes down to, is give us a project and give us some end users that we can practice on, that, I'm not going to lose my job if I make a mistake. And so that's a huge problem right now, is, the companies that are implementing want you to practice on their customers. Their customers when they're calling probably at the worst time, right? Like, let's be honest. When we talk about like customer service, you're not catching the customer typically, at the peak of delight. A lot of times you're catching them because they have a problem and they're unhappy. So there's nothing worse than practicing on not just your customers, but your customers that are, at their most pivotal moment of their engagement with your brand, saying, let's practice on these guys. It's not a...
Well, and as an experienced designer yourself, I know that you were drawn to conversational experiences because they were typically some of the worst experiences that people were having with technology. So, and that kind of continues.
Exactly. And it was for the same reasons. Like, if you looked at why they were so bad, and then you looked at how often they iterated them and they wouldn't change them for like a year. It was just like, don't touch it. It's working.
Yeah, don't
touch
break it.
Yeah, don't break it. It's working. Why? Because the consequences is so mission critical. It's our customers at their worst possible time. So here we are with a brand new technology that can, revolutionize how customers and companies interact. And we're starting with, the most challenging time in the relationship between customers and employee and companies. And
well, you got to wonder too, how many people are just like taking this technology and just applying it the same way they would have applied like a phone tree or something, right? Like they're not seeing what it can become. So they're just like, oh, let's just copy what we were doing and it'll be better, right? It'll be a better experience. And the answer is usually no.
Yeah. I see that a lot out there with senior executives, doing that risk mitigation thing where they ask companies, how much experience do you have with, creating these, and show me other companies that have implemented. And everyone's looking for everyone else to take the leap. And you can just see that sort of mindset, right? I can only justify doing this if it's going to save me a bunch of money on customer service calls. But then that's super risky. So I don't want to take any risks. But this is where I'm going to start. I'm going to start on the most risky projects that we can possibly do. And then they white knuckle it the whole time, as they should, right? They're like on a roller coaster. It seems so obvious to me, right? Start on the merry-go-round. Yeah, it's not going to be as thrilling. It's going to be harder to justify, but practice on your employees. If your bot accidentally says all your products are free, to a customer, they'll expect you to live up to that. If ChatGPT says, oh, everything's free, but employees will just make a joke out of it. But there's no hard consequence. It's not going to hit the news, right?
Yeah.
Or less likely anyway to hit the news. So, yeah, I think it's just, we just got to get all the pieces right. We got to get designers to engage. In order to get designers to engage, we need business to start using this internally. We need business to involve design, in the process, along with technology, and then start implementing, take some chances internally, get familiar, get some wins, build a vision for customer, and then roll to customer, and then just use that pathway, always eat your own dog food, as they say, before you hand it off to your customers. A great example of this is if you have agents, have the agent just be an intermediary. Instead of automating scheduling right away, have the agent do the scheduling in the bot while talking to the customer. And when they feel like that's successful enough, when you feel as a company that agent is unnecessary, then move the experience from the agent to the customer and just do that skill by skill. Just once you feel confident and you build confidence in the interaction by having your agents using it, then you can deploy in that way. It's a fantastic way to mitigate risk. So I guess the moral of the story is they think they're mitigating the risk of wasting money by looking for these clear ROI stories when they're actually creating risk, and that the risk is much higher when you go straight to customer. There's also a silo problem too, because usually the people that are responsible for the customer experience are not responsible for the employee experience. So you need this, and the budgets are separate, and so it really has to be at a top level of the company that says, like, I don't care where the budgets are, we're gonna invest in this employee experience, and ultimately it's gonna feed the customer experience.
It's not impossible to imagine too, like maybe a forward-thinking designer, even in a big company, taking it upon themselves to work with someone internally to mock up an automation. I mean, there's so many tools available right now. A lot of them are free, that you could cobble something together that can represent like what that might look like.
Yeah,
and bring that to leadership.
Yeah, it's a little harder. It's another obstacle is, it's just, you can scan an app in Photoshop and get somebody excited. Done it a million times. You can't scan a conversation. I mean, you can.
Yeah.
You can give somebody a transcript of what the conversation could have been. But there's so many versions of a conversation, that we call them journey mapping. You'd have to create, 10, depending on the interaction, you have to create 10 different circumstances in which that conversation might have happened. So you're looking at 10 different conversations that would be examples of overarching conversations, and then you would have to design within those the visual elements. And so it's just a new way of sharing and conceptualizing before you build. We've been playing a lot with that. I think right now the tools just aren't conducive to that. That's something that we do internally, just because it is so easy to create we call them mock flows, where they're interactive enough. It's kind of like what Figma did to the graphical UI.
Oh yeah,
it made it more clickable, prototypey. Same idea here is, especially in conversation, you need that interaction, even more so. So now that there are tools out there to kind of prototype out some of this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, the difference between reading through a conversational journey map and then just experiencing the conversation is quite vast.
Yeah. Other than, like, you see 3 screenshots that are beautiful and everyone's like, wow, these look amazing. It's sold, right? Business is like, I'm on board. You show them 3 scripts, and they'll be like, I don't,
falling asleep.
I don't get it. You let them interact with it and they're like, wow, it's amazing. But that's another level, and designers don't have the tools right now to pull that off. Again, it's a big focus of what we do internally is those mock flows. Is if we don't materialize it, it's just a bunch of abstract conversations and what feels like a lot of risk taking. So it's chicken or the egg, getting those great experiences out into the world. It's going to happen fast though. It is the big companies that are adopting this. And I think it's because of that. It's like the irony of the whole thing is that they're the ones who have the most to gain by automating simple use cases like password reset, because the ROI of automation at scale for them is so high that they can invest in that automation. It's an easy business case to make, right? Like, if we automate password reset, we can save this many hours and decrease our agent count by X or Y. So since they have the scale to justify the investment, they're the ones leading. And so what does that mean? It means they're going to be the ones that create these innovative experiences that set the bar. And since their customer bases are so big, it's going to happen really fast. It's going to go from people haven't seen these experiences to many people have seen these and now expect it from the smaller companies. And so we'll see the smaller companies trying to keep up with the big companies for a change, which will be an interesting switch.
Everything's certainly on its ear right now.
Yeah. I don't.
Well, all right, Rob, we could probably talk about UX and AI for another 2 hours if we wanted, but I don't know. Maybe can we leave it with maybe some sort of rallying call for designers? Like, if you're a designer working at a big company, what should you be thinking about? And maybe if you're a designer that's working for a small company or kind of a freelance practitioner, like what would your best advice be to those people?
Yeah, my best advice is to look for that internal small project that you can get your team to, your managers to bite off on, to convince them that doing something internally, even if it's just your own team, is something that's well worth doing and is an investment in getting familiar with it. Because without a practical use case to practice on, it's always going to be done in theory, and we all know that's great if you're going from high school to college, but for those of us who have jobs and have to be productive and justify our labor, it's pretty hard to get someone to give you that time to just sit there and learn. So a sanctioned project internally that you're going to deploy that sets a high bar for the experience. I just,
the good news for designers is we need more of their help.
Yeah. So beg for that project. Let me just build a bot for my team. Let me just build a bot for our internal team. Even if it's outside of, like, hey, let's just find out if our team has a group of designers, architects, user research folks that are interested in the area, informally kind of gather and say, hey, let's just as a team build something together for our team. It's a great start.
Sounds like fun.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. Well, until next time then.
All right.
Thanks again for listening. Invisible Machines is produced in partnership with UX Magazine. Be sure to follow UX Magazine wherever you get your podcasts for new episodes. You can also watch us on the Invisible Machines YouTube channel. Shout out to the marketing team at onereach.ai and the marketing team at UX Mag and our video editor, Michael Litvinov. Looking forward to connecting with you next week on another episode of Invisible Machines.